Yep, I should have. Okay. Good evening. I'm Ellen Fishman, and I'm a member of the Library Committee. I want to welcome all of you to this program tonight, and thank, as always, Ann Abrams, who is the beloved, dedicated, and creative leader of our Temple Library. This is the 20th Joy Ungerleider Jewish Book Month program, which is really hard for me to fathom. Joy died in September 1994, and shortly thereafter, her daughter Jeannie endowed this program in her memory, and I want to thank Jeannie and Bill Stone for its continuance. Jeannie has been a friend of mine for more than 40 years, and I was fortunate to meet Joy shortly after I met Jeannie. As I know I've said before, as time passes, a name like the Joy Ungerleider Book Program can start to roll off one's tongue and lose its connection to the person for whom it was named. My wish is that this doesn't happen with this program. I fervently want people to know a little bit about who Joy was and what she was like. The list of her accomplishments is very, very long and very impressive. She dug at Masada with Yigal Yadin. She was curator and director of the Jewish Museum in New York. She authored a magnificent book on Jewish folk art. And she supported institutions in Israel too numerous to mention. And that's just a sampling. At the same time, she was down to earth, unpretentious, and lots of fun. She made great brisket, loved Baskin-Robbins ice cream and chocolate bars, and she was up for adventure any time of day or night. She was a woman of passions, intensely curious, and she emitted boundless and contagious enthusiasm. She created a model of philanthropy that was way ahead of its time in terms of donor involvement, without, however, any micromanagement. Extraordinarily generous, she was interested in philanthropy that would create living, breathing legacies that fostered learning, renewal, connections, and engagement. One such legacy, which was very close to her heart, is the Dorot Fellowship in Israel. The Dorot Foundation website states, "The Dorot Fellowship seeks to enliven the American Jewish landscape by seeding the community with a cadre of outstanding young lay leaders who will create new forms and reinvigorate existing forms of Jewish expression." Levi Kelman, rabbi of Kol HaNishama in Jerusalem, the pluralistic synagogue that was Joy's spiritual home in Israel, said about the program, quote, "You find something from your career choice and you do it here. Such a brilliant idea, such vintage joy. The way to make people feel connected is to make them feel invested. They get hooked in terms of how they feel about Israel." That was Joy's genius, to use her philanthropic resources in such a focused, wise way, not just to dump money into something. She had such a dynamic vision of Israeli society and the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. Our guest tonight, Jay Michaelson, was a Dorot Fellow from 1993 to 1994. Of course, he's not here tonight to talk about the Dorot Fellowship, but it would be so interesting to know how that year impacted the rest of his life's choices. Furthermore, I know that Joy would have dearly loved to be here this evening to listen to Jay Michaelson and to find out more about who he is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm Ann Abrams, the librarian of Temple Israel, and Shabbat Shalom. Oh, stop. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to call your attention to these, which side? Lovely boutonnieres that the members of the library committee and I are wearing, courtesy of Temple member Steve Rittner. Please feel free to come up to any of us if you have any questions about this program, the committee, or the Dr. Arnold L. Siegel Library Center. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Dr. J. Michaelson is an author, activist, and academic. He's a weekly columnist for the Daily Beast and the Forward newspaper, and is the author of 5 books, including the best-selling God vs. Gay, The Religious Case for Equality. Jay holds a PhD in Jewish thought from Hebrew University, as well as a JD from Yale, BA from Columbia, and non-denominational rabbinic ordination. A frequent commentator on emerging forms of Jewish identity, Jay is the founder of 3 Jewish nonprofits: Zeke, the first Jewish online magazine; Nehirim, a national LGBT Jewish community; and Eshel, an LGBT Orthodox organization. Currently a visiting scholar at Brown University, an adjunct professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, Jay has held teaching positions at Boston University Law School, City College of New York, and Yale University. He's been a scholar in residence at dozens of synagogues, Hillels, and other institutions, and has been included on the Forward 50 list of influential American Jews. He lives outside New York City. And when I did a Google alert on him, just to learn a little more about him, I got a lot of messages every day. So if you're interested in learning more about him after tonight, just Google him. Let's all welcome Jay Michaelson.
Hi, everyone, and Shabbat Shalom. It really is an honor to be here. I was fortunate enough to know Joy during my year in Israel, 1993-94, and she actually grilled me on my application interview for the Durot Fellowship. So hopefully she'll be happy to know how things turned out. It was certainly it was a wonderful and grueling interview. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the future of the S word. Spirituality, particularly because we're at a moment of total transformation in the United States as to how we relate to this term and how we relate to what it is to pursue a certain kind of excellence that was once at the center of a number of religious disciplines, but which is now in secular form being practiced by millions of Americans for stress reduction or for excellence in business or for healing from trauma. But before I do any of that, I wanted to start with a joke. Probably most of you have heard this Jewish joke. I'll be able to tell right away because you'll nod when I say the first line. But it really, actually, I think illustrates something tremendously important about the spiritual quest and the spiritual journey. So forgive me if you've heard this before. So there's a Jewish grandmother and her grandson at the beach. And there's a lot of nodding. And the grandson is playing by the shore in the waves and having fun, and all of a sudden, a tragedy happens. A huge wave comes and washes the grandson out to sea. So the grandmother, understandably, is distraught. She falls on her knees immediately and prays to God. And she says, God, I know I haven't always been such a good Jew. I don't even know if I believe in you, but if you'll just return my grandson to me, I'll be eternally grateful. I'll never question you ever again. And wouldn't you know, her prayers are so sincere that God causes a wave to wash the grandson back onto the beach. And this is it. This is the moment that Abraham Joshua Heschel called radical amazement, the birth of religious consciousness. Right? A moment of wonder and a transcendent experience, just like at the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. And so what does she do? She looks at her grandson, and she looks up at heaven, and she says, he had a hat. This Anyone ever have a he had a hat moment? Right? We have them all the time. I lived in Brookline, actually, for 2 years, and I would have he had a hat moments every time I was stuck in traffic on Beacon because the lights aren't in sync. And even though I grew up in New York where they are in sync, and even though I was healthy and vibrant and happy and life was good and things were developing in my world, I wanted to kill everyone on Beacon. I wanted to destroy it. It was a moment of, right, he had a hat. Right? Here we are surrounded by wonders, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said, wonders that confound the imagination. But we have like a little hand that blocks the light, and we're not able to see them. Right? This is the nature of what it is to be human. It's not necessarily because we're bad people, but because we're human people. So if you think of it this way, we are descended from 5 billion years of kvetching. Right? There's a saying in the Talmud, the Pirkei Avot, Ezehu Ashir Asamech Bechalko, who is wealthy, who's rich, the one who's happy with his or her share. But that's not how it works, right? For 5 billion years, we're descended from the ones who were not happy with their share. Our cave women and caveman ancestors who were content and happy got eaten by wolves. They didn't go out and hunt. They didn't reproduce. They didn't, right? Even the paramecium that we're all descended from and the primordial ooze, if it was happy with what it was and not trying to divide and make more paramecia, we wouldn't be here. And it's funny, even that joke, which obviously is, kind of a very human story, I actually thought a little bit about Joy when I heard that story, because she would definitely say he had a hat. Right? Not out of a sense of insufficiency, but out of a demand for more justice, for more truth, for something better. Right? This is what it is to be, I think, a certain kind of prophetic American Jew in the 21st century. That we're not satisfied with our share or with how things are. Or, I was about to say something political, so you just insert whatever you're not satisfied with politically right there. So it's not that this dissatisfaction is a bad thing, but another famous Hasidic rabbi, Mick Jagger, said recently, you can't always get what you want. And so we suffer. We suffer because we're human, because we want what it is that we cannot have, and we take for granted what we do have. Byron Katie, who's a contemporary spiritual teacher, says that the spiritual quest, spiritual success, it's not about getting what you want, it's wanting what you have. Right? Hakarat HaTov, the Jewish tradition, calls this. So I want to make 7 points about why this kind of spiritual excellence deserves a certain kind of intellectual credibility and deserves to be taken out of the attic where we keep all of our kind of slightly embarrassing souvenirs from different parts of our lives and put into the center of our Jewish lives. And then, and I am going to do this on time, I'm going to make 7 more points about the future of where this endeavor is going. The first point is the one I've already just made, the very basic understanding that spirituality is a counter-natural movement that corrects something that's absolutely essential to all of us. Now, we may believe that actually all of us are pure beings and we've never done anything wrong except then that woman in the tree with the apple and the snake and the talking lizard, and so she ate the thing and now we're all fallen and sinful. You may have that belief, or you may have a belief that we're actually space aliens. This is a Scientology belief, and we're kind of encased in these human bodies, and so we're frail. But I don't actually have those beliefs. I have this belief that we're human. And what is it that we can do to flourish in our lives and to aid and ease the suffering of those who are around us, to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted? This is a very simple definition, to me, of what I see the spiritual path as being about. Any act, obviously, can be spiritual. It's not about acts. It's not about religion. You can light a candle when the electricity goes out, and it's not necessarily spiritual, although it might be. Or you might light a Shabbat candle, and then it is spiritual. Or you might just light a candle for a romantic dinner and have that be a moment of presence, a moment of awareness, a moment of not saying he had a hat, but of Hakarat HaTov, of recognizing the good. It's really more of a purpose, a description. Spirituality is an adjective, maybe, or an adverb. To be a little bit more precise, I'll make my second point, which is to maybe have a rough definition of what I'm talking about. I think a spiritual experience is an intentional experience that transforms the nature of experience itself. I'll say that again. An intentional experience that transforms the nature of experience itself, ideally with ethical or personal consequences. So what do I mean by that? If you came into temple today thinking about your mortgage, and you were able to participate in the services a little bit, and you shifted your mind to now be thinking about love or friendship or justice, that's it, right? It's just a simple transformation from one mind state to another. That can be it. It just in a simple way. We move out of our own stuff and into something that's maybe a little bit more nourishing or leads to a little bit more compassion and a little bit more wisdom. Ironically, the spiritual path itself sometimes becomes its very opposite, right? It fails when it actually serves to augment the self. So does anyone practice yoga, right? So if we have our yoga mat, and this is my yoga mat, and don't come near my yoga mat because I spent a lot of money on this nice yoga mat, and it's not your yoga mat, and I'm always in this place in the yoga class, right? We can fall into what Trungpa Rinpoche, a great Buddhist teacher of the last century, called spiritual materialism. We can also fall into a certain kind of what our own tradition calls idolatry. There's a wonderful story from the Sufi tradition, the mystical Muslim tradition, that there's a prisoner he's in a prison, because that's where prisoners are. He's in a prison, and he's praying, and he's very devout. And so, in fact, the Prophet Muhammad appears to him and says, "Behold, here are the keys to your cell. You can set yourself free." And the prisoner is so overcome with piety and joy that he takes the key ring and puts it on the wall and prays to it 5 times a day. I call this fetishizing the trigger, where there's a trigger to our own spiritual experience, and we make an idol out of that trigger, right? There are all of these tools and technologies that we have for spirituality are fingers pointing at the moon, but they're not the moon, right? But now we can argue about who has the better finger and who's pointing the more direct, and get very uptight when the finger used to be in this position and now it's in this position. We used to sing that tune and now we sing this tune, and so now I'm really upset. Right? So spirituality can easily become its opposite. A form of transcending the self can be a form of augmenting the self or aggrandizing the self. In fact, springing from our own tradition, the Kabbalah Center promises that you can actually get what you want. By using the right mechanistic operations of magical Kabbalah, you can get what you want. One of the most popular fads of the last 20 years in the kind of New Age world is something called The Secret, or the Teachings of Abraham, that you can create your own reality, which would come as a shock maybe to people who have ever suffered from a disease. But I digress. Spirituality can easily become its own opposite. Third, I want to suggest that there is a distinction between spirituality and religion. Religion tends to be mythic and world-building. It constructs meaning. Spirituality tends to be functional and often world-destroying, transforming. Religion is generally collective and shared and has to do with beliefs and stories, even laws and truths. Spirituality can be done together. It can be a joint communal enterprise, but it's also irreducibly personal. It's about experience and subjectivity. It's about autonomy of experience, not heteronomy of law. Or if you like it this way, religion is for those afraid of going to hell. Spirituality is for people who have been there. Fourth, there's something important, I think, about the notion of experience in the way that spiritual practice is understood today. I want to suggest that all of us can become connoisseurs of our own experience, such that we can truly live what Blake said, to see eternity in a grain of sand, infinity in an hour. One time I was sitting a longish meditation retreat at the Insight Meditation Society over in Barrie. This was 6 weeks of silence. Incident, my longest time in silence was 5 months, which is why I talk so quickly now to make up for all of that lost time. But this was a 6-week retreat, and we were doing a Buddhist practice called eating meditation, which is just meditation except with food. Very Jewish, actually, if you think about it. I do have a project called Eat Your Way to Enlightenment, which is the Jewish art of eating meditation, but I haven't published that yet. So I was doing eating meditation on a string bean. Just an ordinary string bean, nothing particularly, not fancy, not even French. And I looked at the string bean, and it was so succulent. This sort of the juiciness of it, I think it had been steamed. And I put it in my mouth, and it exploded. And I actually cried over the string bean. It was that beautiful. Sometimes I think that becoming a connoisseur of experience, we can life is like a radio. We can either turn up the volume and have really powerful experiences so that we can hear the music, or we could try to tune it in a little bit more and turn down the static so that we can hear the music that's already there. I'm all for turning up the volume. I go to Burning Man every year for 14 years. I think it's great. We should all have wild, insane, crazy experiences, but it's also not necessarily sustainable. It's difficult to be responsible while doing that. It's hard to do with raising a family and being in your community and having. So it's also how valuable, how precious, what a gift to be able to turn down the static and to not have to have a profound experience. Often when you say, well, when have you felt the most spiritual, whatever that means, people will come up with a moment, right? So birth of a child, or I saw the Grand Canyon, or something that's profound. A friend of mine just got back from an incredibly powerful program doing a meditation retreat at Auschwitz-Birkenau. This wonderful, incredible program that he just participated in. So a peak experience. It's also possible to have profound and moving experiences with a string bean. Sixth, there's something specifically Jewish about Jewish spirituality that distinguishes it from other forms of spirituality, which is tied to the Jewish notion that the righteous life is a life lived in community, in society, making the world a better place. We oscillate in the Hasidic language, oscillate between what they call God's point of view, in which everything is God and everything is holy and you are pure and everything is beautiful, that peak experience moment that we've all had glimpses of, but which we can have it's so simple, 7 days of silent meditation or prayer or some other spiritual practice, and you can have the experiences that are written about by the mystical masters without believing anything. When I found that out, I'd spent most of my 20s kind of studying this literature in an academic context. And I found out that there was somebody actually promising the same kinds of experiences that I'd read about, but I didn't have to believe anything stupid. I didn't have to, sacrifice my own intellectual credibility or my own beliefs. I went for it. And lo and behold, it was true. You could have those experiences. They left out the fine print that in order to get there on day 7, you had to do six days of soul-searing, incredibly difficult work, looking at your own stuff and realizing what a schmendrick you are. But it was worth it. But we don't stay in that peak experience in the Jewish tradition. There's not a notion that the enlightened being is someone sitting on top of a mountaintop, always bathing in the light of the Shekhinah, the divine presence. That's not the Jewish sage. The Jewish sage actually moves constantly in what's called ratzov v'shov, like the angels in the story of Jacob's ladder, moving back and forth between this world in which there's so much work to do and those peak experiences which can come in prayer or can come in meditation. It's an experiential movement of times of closeness and times of what Elie Wiesel called the eclipse of God. This is kind of the nature of things. In certain forms of Hindu and Buddhist teaching, and I teach in Buddhist contexts as well as in Jewish ones, there is a notion that the world as it appears is kind of either the shell of the truth or a delusion where actually, and the point is to lift the delusion, to lift the veil. Not all of those traditions say, but there's that line of teaching. Interestingly, you only very rarely, very, very rarely find that idea of world negation in the Jewish tradition. This is instead God dancing as you. This is the moment. This is it. If God is everywhere in the Jewish tradition and the conception of God, and I'll say more about that word in a little bit, then if it hasn't been here all the time, it's not it. It's not the thing that we're holding on to, because we're not holding on to anything. Judaism tends to be more of a householder religion than a monastic religion. Have you noticed that there's almost no monastic tradition in Judaism? There are a couple of marginal communities here and there, the Essenes maybe, and there's some community. There's some exceptions to the rule. But when you compare it with 1,000 years of monastic Christianity in Europe, for example, or living, vibrant traditions of Zen monks in Japan, or Burmese monks, or Thai Buddhist monks, it's really remarkable that there aren't really Jewish monks or nuns. There's something intrinsically tied to the nature of the engagement with the Jewish world that marks its form of spiritual practice. Last thing I want to say, and then I want to shift to talk a little bit about trends and things that are changing. There's something really affirming and powerful to me that spiritual practice, when done right, can be done with the body, with the heart, with the mind, and with something that seems to even be transpersonal. It can be as simple as just relaxing and becoming more aware of what your body is feeling right now. You could do it right now. What's the predominant feeling that you're feeling? Whatever, tightness, or weight, excitement, had too much kiddush wine, sleepiness, that ache that you still have from the, right? Just becoming aware, a little bit more mindful, showing up. That's a moment of not saying he had a hat. It's a moment of recognizing just what is. What's going on right now, and can I be with it? Simple. What's going on right now, and can I be with it? And why is that of any value? Because you can't always get what you want. And so there's a training of mind that takes place in that moment-to-moment relinquishing of the sense of something else is the thing that I actually want, and this isn't it. It's a training of mind. I'll say more about that in just a moment. It can also take place purely on the level of the heart, cultivating feelings of loving kindness or compassion, or purely on the level of mind, insight, wisdom, reflection, contemplation. Sometimes spirituality in the 20th century was very anti-intellectual because it was rebelling against what it perceived to be a dry rationalism of the technological age. Okay, that was their hang-up. It doesn't have to be ours, right? It's possible actually to fully embrace all of the intellectual curiosities and criticisms that one might have, while at the same time believing that there's another axis of human excellence that's worth developing. We shouldn't be spiritual 98-pound weaklings, capable of quoting Homer in Greek, but incapable of noticing when we're trapped by an unskillful emotion and learning how to just get out of it without saying something unkind or doing something cruel. We don't have to actually be emotional 98-pound weaklings, capable of making having lots of success and making lots of money in our professions, but unable to restrain ourselves from acting like emotional infants when a conflict arises in our synagogue or our boardroom or our office. I just wrote a column about that, so it's in the front of my head. It is possible to focus on the self in the way that we focus on the other things that are important in our lives. Why do I say that we're at a moment of transformation for all this? Isn't this all old stuff that's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years? There are 1 million new meditators in America every year. That's the statistic. Where are folks accessing meditation? Is it in temples and synagogues? Actually, it's in hospitals and schools. Right? Most Americans who are coming in contact with meditation, spiritual practice, in America today are coming in contact with it in healthcare contexts because it's been demonstrated to have enormous health benefits. And we're only getting started. The data is now so solid on the decrease of healthcare utilization by simple mindfulness interventions, which are basically cost-free, that capitalism is going to spread the Dharma, right? Put on your insurance company hat for a moment, especially under the Affordable Care Act. So you're insuring a huge number of people who are suffering from various chronic conditions and other conditions. And if they just learn to breathe in a certain way, they won't go to the hospital as much. If meditation and mindfulness interventions can decrease hospitalization by 0.1%, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Right? And I don't need to preach it because it's already happening. It's happening on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley, where stress reduction has been found to improve productivity and happiness. We may forget that actually a lot of people who work as hard as folks in those contexts do are actually deeply unhappy on a day-to-day basis. And they can be more efficient workers if they're actually happy. And so this is now being implemented. A number of Fortune 50 companies have implemented mindfulness as optional human resources programs in their businesses. Sometimes this can get a little bit challenging for those of us who grew up with spirituality as something about the heart, the fact that now bankers are doing it. And so I want to tell you a story about that. I was at I was at a conference called Wisdom 2.0 in San Francisco last year. Wisdom 2.0 is, as the name may imply, the joining of mindfulness and the spiritual world with the technology companies in Silicon Valley. And it was an incredibly irritating conference. Half of the people who were there were so full of themselves, and now they had a new reason to be full of themselves. Not only was Twitter revolutionizing communication as we know it, for better or worse, but now they were also going to be enlightened while actually revolutionizing communication. And many people were there to network, and other people were, and you know, after 3 days of hearing people bloviate about how meditation and mindfulness makes them more efficient, I'd had about enough. And a former Marine named Meg Pelasco got up and told her story. She had been sexually assaulted by a superior and was suffering from PTS, post-traumatic stress, what we used to call post-traumatic stress disorder. And she had fallen, in addition, into a very deep depression. The PTS was, she wasn't able to sleep. She was having nightmares all of the time. And as many women in the armed forces experienced, she was unable to report the sexual assault because it was her superior who assaulted her, and she felt that if she reported it, her military career would be over. And I'm sure we've read about these stories. Medical interventions weren't working. Medications weren't working. She had a number of suicide attempts and constant suicidal ideation. And what worked for her was a mindfulness-based intervention. At Green Gulch Farm, actually, which is affiliated with Zen Buddhism. And it changed her life. That's not true for everyone, of course. Certainly it's not, meditation and mindfulness is not a replacement for medication or for other methods of addressing serious depression. But it worked for her. And that's why, then I remembered why I was there at this idiotic Wisdom 2.0 conference. It wasn't about the tech zillionaires becoming happy tech zillionaires. It was about the fact that we could lessen suffering with a spiritual technology that's in the Jewish tradition, in other traditions, and has been there for hundreds of years. That it actually works, that it's been demonstrated both in clinical trials on the one hand and in neuroscientific studies on the other. So it's not kind of voodoo. We don't know why it really works, but it seems to work. We actually know exactly which parts of the brain are activated during mindfulness. We understand how the prefrontal cortex works to mediate the impulses of the amygdala, that fight or flight part of the reptilian brain. You know, I want it. How did I miss the light there? Oh my God, I have to get to Coolidge Corner, right? That part of the brain. And we understand that the prefrontal cortex actually changes. Up until 15 years ago, the day before yesterday in scientific time, it was commonly understood that the brain you were born with would be the brain, more or less, that you would die with. It grows, obviously, during adolescence, right? And then it stops. We now know that that's not true at all. The idea of neuroplasticity, that the brain can change over time. You may not have thought when you were coming to services tonight that you were here to change your brain, but in fact, that may be what took place. Meditating is just like going to the gym. It's something that's done to the physical body that enables the human being to have a greater capacity of wisdom and compassion. So what are some of those trends that are now being impacted by this radically new moment in our understanding of what spiritual practice is? I think first and foremost, it's that we can finally get serious about spirituality and not relegate it to the intellectual basement in which it sometimes is thrown. This is actually a demonstrable shift in the capacities of human intellect. It also, by the way, improves memory, decreases the sort of certain symptoms of senility in old age. It helps boost immune function. I could go on. I sound sort of like a salesman. But in fact, the numbers of the kinds of changes and transformations that are being documented are enough for us to actually get serious about what we mean by this concept of spirituality, that it's part of human potential, that it has real-world consequences, that it is possible to integrate the intellect and the spirit, that it's possible to identify what it is about spiritual practice that has what effects. So for some people, this kind of left-brain talk about spirituality may be actually deeply alienating, and for that I apologize. But I want to tell another story. When I was leading a meditation sit on a 7-day retreat, I'm co-teaching the Jewish meditation program at Isabella Friedman, a retreat center in Connecticut. It takes place on Christmas week. You can come join us for a week of some silence and some song and some chanting and maybe some enlightenment, although you have to sign we can't actually guarantee full enlightenment on the retreat. I was sitting leading one of the sessions, and my eyes were open, at that time because I was trying not to fall asleep. And I saw someone out there just as I'm looking at this group of people, I saw someone and she moved. She readjusted her posture, which if you're a meditator, you know is bad, 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 right? You're not supposed to move. You're supposed to sit there and be miserable. And if you're the person who's sitting next to the person who moves, you're supposed to be angry because they're ruining your meditation and you're trying to calm down. Okay, so obviously that's not really true, but that is how we often feel. At this moment, when I saw this person move and shift her posture, the first feeling that actually legitimately arose in my heart was actually compassion. The first feeling that I noticed was, I hope she's okay. I mean, you shift when you're shift position because you're feeling pain, right? And I hope she's not feeling. I hope that she moved. Okay, I hope she's not stuck with it, and that she doesn't keep thinking, oh, I shouldn't have moved. I hope she just goes on with her practice and feels, and gets what she wants, and that for me was remarkable, right? I mean, I'm not an optimist by nature. I think the glass is half empty and the water is evaporating. I grew up. I live in New York City. We're not trained to be nice and compassionate, right? You won't even get on the subway if you're being nice and compassionate. Somebody else will push in front of you. And the first thing that I actually felt subjectively, what I had read about objectively in some of the scientific studies, that it is possible to rewire some of our habitual responses to stimuli. It is possible to have a moment of gratitude before saying he had a hat. And for me, that's a small moment. But there are a number of bigger moments when the same thing has happened. One time I was giving a talk on, you heard one of the books I wrote was something called God versus Gay, the religious case for equality. I go through that. The basic argument of the book is that our shared religious values support equality for LGBT folks. Not so we don't have to make it fit. We actually have to live out our positive values. So I was giving a talk on this subject at Limud, which is a wonderful trans-denominational Jewish learning conference. And there was someone kind of toward the back who was wearing a black hat and a beard, so probably ultra-Orthodox. And ever heard the joke, we Jews have a way of indicating when it is we want to speak? We interrupt. Right, that one. So he was living out his truth by interrupting. So he interrupted me in the middle of this talk and said, what about bestiality? So we've heard this before. This is the Rick Santorum argument that, if we let two men or two women marry, the next thing it's going to be man on dog. Because I remember just a few years ago, folks were standing out on the steps of the State House arguing for same-sex marriage, and equal numbers of people were there arguing for interspecies marriage. Anyway, so what do you do in that moment? As an advocate and as an activist, it was clear what I needed to do. All I had to do was be the more reasonable person in that moment. Something unreasonable had been said. And rather than so I may have wanted to react, I may have wanted to say how offensive and how could you say that, and some people actually in the audience did do that, but I didn't do that. There was a moment of mindfulness that just took place in that moment. It was very clear what I needed to do. And so I pointed to my engagement ring, now wedding ring, and my partner actually was on the steps of the State House with probably many of you several years ago. Pointed to my wedding ring and said, well, all right, let's see. Is that true? Is it true that I don't know my own soul? So you know that you're telling me that there's no difference between the love I feel for my partner and something someone might feel, the lust someone might feel for a goat or for a sheep? Is that true? He changed the subject, which meant I won, right? So that was good. But more importantly, just having the mental spaciousness in that moment to not flip out. Right? We've entered a period in our politics that's not just divisive, but mean divisive. Right? Politics has always been mean. There's always been vulgarity. Just read your Catullus, or read from ancient Rome, which now, thanks to Ted Cruz, people are reading Cicero again. So that's good, I guess, right? But now we do seem to be in a particular moment of rage as a dignified form of political expression. What are the tools that we have to rise above that? This is how it works for me. Second point I wanted to make about future trends has to do with state to stage. So it's nice to have fun experiences, and again, I'm a big fan of that. But what really matters is the transformation that those experiences can bring about. I'll give you an example. Scholars, when they learned about the different kinds of Kabbalah following Gershom Scholem, there are basically three main types of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. One of them is usually called by scholars ecstatic Kabbalah, because the experience that's brought about is one of ecstasy, of the soul leaving the body and that cosmology, or just a heightened state, if we're more scientific about it. Actually, the way that Kabbalah refers to itself is not ecstatic Kabbalah, ecstatic, an English term derived from Greek, but prophetic Kabbalah, Kabbalah Nevu'it. What's the difference? If we see a practice as something about getting high and having ecstasy, well, that's kind of a cul-de-sac, right? If we see a practice as something that enables deeper insight, prophecy, wisdom, then the purpose of having the wonderful whiz-bang beautiful experiences, which I've also had and which I also strongly recommend, and which are some of those profound experiences that it is your birthright to experience, but all of that beautiful experience is actually in the service of greater wisdom and greater compassion. How am I changed as a result of this experience? And I think that's a challenge that I would lay down any time we're engaging in a religious or spiritual practice. That sort of functional question, what does this practice do? It brings a community together. It educates children. It moves me out of my own selfish stuff and into wider concerns about social justice. It inspires me. It makes me feel closer to the source of love in my own life. Right? We can ask that question about any practice, spiritual or religious, that we're engaging in, and my claim is that asking the question is a way of improving the results and refining the technique itself. Third, there's something important, I think, about essence and adaptation. That we've seen in the Buddhist world a move from a religious practice practiced by monks to a spiritual practice practiced by a lot of people to a secular technology to what's now called the neurodharma, the dharma, the Buddhist teaching that's now been actually interpreted in neuroscientific terms, as I mentioned before. Is Judaism moving, I wonder, in similar directions? Are we moving from an authoritarian religious frame to something about spirituality to what exactly? What's the essence that we want to maintain as we transform our Jewish lives and our spiritual lives? And what are the pieces which we want to put down and pick up? There's a long history of reforms and distillations within religious traditions. The reform movement in Judaism, for example. The Buddhist forms that came to America about 100 years ago were actually reforms in Buddhism in Asia. What are the pieces that are essential, and what are the pieces that we can adapt? Fourth, and I'm doing well, right? I'm ahead of schedule, and I'm 4 out of 7, or actually 11 out of 14. That's all because of meditation. It's actually right now. So a few weeks ago, I was here in Boston talking at the International Symposium of Contemplative Studies, which you may have missed. I know it was on the front page of the Herald when it took place. Everybody was there. It was just incredible. The lines out the door. It's interesting that Jewish contemplative practice is now being measured in the same way that secular mindfulness and Buddhist-derived practices were. But we're really at square one. What would we even actually be measuring? What would we be looking for? What are the changes that we would be looking for as we design a contemplative regime for ourselves? Maybe, if we're lucky, the biggest problems that we have to deal with are managing our temper a little bit better, or being a little bit more, feeling a little bit more grateful each day. Maybe actually we have bigger challenges. Maybe it's keeping our sanity in an insane world. Maybe it's having the resiliency to do the social justice activism that we talk about, but how do we do it? What are the tools that are necessary to do it? There's a myth that's been out there that spirituality and social justice are somehow opposed to one another, that this is associated with Zizek, the Marxist philosopher, that if you do too much meditation, too much yoga, you'll be happy with your existence, and you shouldn't be happy because there are so many things you should be unhappy about. And the problem with us is that we're too happy. Is that true for anybody? Right. For myself, I don't need to be reminded about the depth of the environmental crisis or the challenges facing sexual and gender minorities in the global South. I just have to say the words, or let alone Israel-Palestine. And I feel I can immediately tap in to plenty of sadness and righteous indignation that gets me very angry. Right? And wherever we are in all those political spectrums, I think that's true. I don't think we need to be irritated more I think those of us who have dedicated our lives to social justice activism, or who have dedicated our spare time to social justice activism, we need tools and sustenance to be able to do that work sustainably. What would some of those tools be? What are the ways that we can actually measurably increase our capacity for more resilience in the face of adversity? Fifth, and nearly finally, one of the trends that's taking place right now in Jewish spirituality is a kind of hybridization and differentiation at the same time. Everyone's heard the term Jubu or Buju. It's now actually, we're now beyond the initial phase of that hybridization. I don't think it's a big deal for somebody to reveal to you that I meditate. Right? That's not a secret anymore. We've all come out of the closet that we may meditate now and then. Right? Now, actually, I think we're entering a much more mature phase of differentiating and understanding what the Jewish contributions to American spirituality might be. Something about juiciness, appreciating the holy in our lives, which can be a secular category that doesn't really depend on the belief in this or that God. By the way, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory, one of my favorite quotes of his was, I don't believe in the same God you don't believe in. Just put that out there as a little Zen koan. Hakarat HaTov, I mentioned already, the midot, the personality traits that are so important to Jewish spiritual practice, the possibility that we're doing this work not just for its own sake, but to do the holy work that we have in the world. These are related. There are analogs in other traditions, particularly in Buddhist ones, but they're also very Jewishly specific. Reb Zalman also had an idea that all of the religions of the world were like different organs in the body. And we want to differentiate and embrace all of those. Or it's not like, oh, the spleen is so much better than the pancreas. That's not it. We need a spleen and a pancreas. What are the different functions that each of our traditions do in a sort of global organismic model of evolving consciousness? Sixth, we've seen a number of instances of unethical behavior in our spiritual leaders. That's true in the Jewish community. It's true in every spiritual community that I've ever known about. It's interesting to see some of the trends of autonomy, decentralization, and what I would call the onlineization, the Web 2.0ization of taking command and control of our own spiritual lives. Command and control maybe that's too patriarchal. Let's say taking ownership and loving responsibility for our own spiritual lives. I love the fact that there are multiple rabbis here, and every rabbi would love to have the colleagues that these rabbis have in one another. Forget the rabbi already, right? Own your own Jewish practice. Own your Jewish spirituality. It's actually possible, and the rabbis will thank you for it, that we can become empowered connoisseurs of Jewish spiritual practice. That's actually shifting now in a way that was not happening 10 and 15 years ago, and I find it incredibly exciting. The generation that's come of age with Occupy-style political activism is not interested in being lectured to by a patriarch like me. That's not what spiritual activism and spiritual practice looks like. And it's not also what a certain kind of justice activism looks like either. That, I think, is one of the most exciting trends in the sort of new future of Jewish spirituality. Finally, there's something about integration. I've mentioned already the integration of spirituality and social justice. It is convenient that the same technologies that bring about a decrease in personal narcissism bring out an increase in the concern for others. My great fantasy is to have the politicians who I really can't stand, whose names may rhyme with Shmeni, in a room doing the kind of mindfulness and meditation practice that I've practiced, not to change anybody's political minds, but just to open up the heart to the consequences of our political views. And that doesn't change views. That actually integrates the different parts of the commitments that we hold dear. I do a fair amount of work. Sometimes people know my Israel-Palestine work by the articles I write, which anger people. But I've actually done a fair amount of work trying to get people with radically different views to sit and just talk, and even more importantly than talk, listen. And it's interesting, a lot of that is hard-nosed stuff. We really disagree about these issues. And that's fine, right? It's two Jews, three opinions, and the rabbis in the Talmud said that a machloket, a debate for the sake of heaven, will go on forever, which, if you've ever been to my Seder table, you know is true. And that's actually, right, that should be a source of strength, right? This is a value that we have, that we can hold diversity of opinion. And yet, obviously, it's not really working. And, it's interesting. I'm friends with Melissa Weintraub, who's running a fantastic program for the Jewish Council on Public Affairs called Resetting the Table, about could we actually have a different kind of conversation around this contentious issue. And a lot of what we do is pretty hard-nosed stuff and, looking at maps and multiple narratives. And a lot of it is really woo-woo, meditation-y, touchy-feely spirituality, because actually, at the end of the day, it's not touchy-feely at all. It's actually the technologies that are there to improve these kinds of conversations. I want to end with a short story. It's actually an excerpt from Mark Twain's Huck Finn, and probably some of you have heard this as well. And I end with this because I did actually count, and the number of talks I gave on the God versus Gay tour, which, like Bob Dylan's tour, is sort of never-ending, I gave 83 talks about God versus Gay to different churches and synagogues, religious groups, LGBT groups, campus Hillel groups, and so on. And I ended every talk with this story, with this excerpt from Huck Finn. And so I'm ending this talk with it now as a meta story, which is this story for me captures not just the essence of opening our minds on issues of political justice, but also of what it means to be a spiritual human being. The story comes somewhere in the middle of the novel, where Huck's been floating down the raft with Jim, who's an escaped slave, and they've had all kinds of various adventures. But the whole time that the story of the novel has been playing out, Huck's actually been having a spiritual crisis, because he's been taught in school that if you don't turn in an escaped slave, you're going to go to hell. So the whole time that the narrative is unfolding, Huck feels he needs to turn Jim in. And finally, it reaches a boiling point, and Huck writes a letter turning Jim in, saying where they're hiding. And in Mark Twain's writing, Huck says, "I felt pure and washed clean of sin for the first time in my life." Right? Spiritual experience. But the crucial next few words is what makes it a real spiritual experience. Because Huck says, "But then I went on thinking." And Huck recalls the action of the previous 100 pages of the book, that he and Jim had saved each other's lives, that they'd narrowly escaped danger, that they love each other, and that he's seen that Jim is a human being. And so Huck says, "I was in a close place, right? Because I was between two things and I knew it." And he doesn't know what to do. And Huck says, "All right then, I'll go to hell." And he tears up the letter. Notice that progression, that spiritual progression. There's an idea that we have, that we've been taught, that's been repeated. We come to believe it, but then we go on thinking. We have the capacity to reflect rationally, intelligently on that situation, and it becomes its own spiritual experience, right? And notice that what happens for Huck is ironic in several ways, right? Obviously, we know this isn't the moment of his damnation, it's the moment of his salvation, right? This is the moment, Huck Finn is a coming-of-age novel, and this is the moment of Huck Finn coming of age. Right? And not only that, we know that in telling us the story, just like the Baal Shem Tov, right, says, "Oh, we used to know where to go, and then now we don't even know, but we can tell the story." Right? Just in telling us the story, we have that capacity to enter in to that peak experience, to that spiritual experience of openness that Huck Finn had, just in the telling of the story by Mark Twain and someone reading it in high school. And Huck doesn't know that either. Huck thinks in that moment that he's in a place of tightness and constriction, and actually he's just risen above the very religious community that he's afraid of being kicked out of. It's that moment, I think, that we want to encourage in all of our lives, sacred, profane, magical, and mundane. It's that moment of, I didn't know what was true, and now suddenly a new truth has opened up. Or in the words of the Torah itself, that God was in this place, and I didn't know it. Thank you.
Just want to thank Jay Michaelson and for all of you for coming, and we have the opportunity to spend more time with Jay across the hall in Levy Auditorium for Q&A and delicious oneg. So Shabbat Shalom, and thank you very much to Jay Michaelson. All right, so we're just going across the hall. I'll get you some food.